So this is just a brief reminder. Property rights consist of a bundle of rights, both use rights and management or decision-making rights. And the furthest reaching rights are those to alienation or transfer. So the right to hand a resource to others, either by inheritance or by selling it. And very often natural resources are restricted, so the rights that people have over natural resources are restricted in one or other way. Just let me know if there's any questions on this. I'm just assuming you've heard about this and know this, but if that's not the case, do let me know. Now, basically, the right establishes a relationship not from me to the resource, but rather between me and everyone else in society, because it's only mine if everyone else agrees it's mine and that I have these and hold these rights. Now, in many countries, we have a pluralism of different systems and options of recognizing rights that may be overlapping and often also competing. So they reach all the way from international treaties and laws over state law to religious law or customary law, which may be opposing to the previous mentioned ones. And it goes all the way down to organizational law, so user groups. If you live in a condominium somewhere, there might be a whole set of rules going up to the color of your curtains that are established by the group and have no legal basis, but nonetheless apply. So basically this means, or not necessarily this, but goods can be provided in different formats, either as private goods, where others can be excluded, as public goods, where this is not the case, and as common property, where a group of users share rights and collectively manage and enjoy the benefits of a resource. So you've seen this one. What I'd like you to briefly think about and then tell me is what happens to the rights in these different situations. If a value or a value is recognized, an ecosystem value is recognized in society, who holds the rights and in what format? You think of an example of recognized value?
Like a national park.
Yeah. So who has the rights there? Yeah. And it's established in that case by national law. And the fact that we call it recognized value kind of leads to the fact that these property rights are recognized by at least most of the society, which, as I said earlier, in circumstances of overlapping regimes might not be the case. This might customarily be an area where population has been living and people have been using the forest, and they might challenge that. But how about the situation of demonstrating value? What's the right situation there usually? If we feel the need to demonstrate a value.
Like a personal or a user right? So I'm thinking of like in a case where we need to demonstrate the value of a ecosystem service that's not being properly included in the decision making. The rights, there's going to be a tension between the rights of the people who might own that resource and the rights of the group at large who benefit from the service.
Yeah.
So sort of, I guess, different ones.
Yeah. So typically in situations where we want to demonstrate value, the right situation is not so clear. And for many ecosystem services that are under-provisioned or that are as yet not clearly defined, rights are not defined yet. So the aspect of scenic beauty is something we value, but there's not much definition of that. Usually, there might be some building codes that do recognize it, but. And how about the situation of capturing value? Yes?
Payments for ecosystem services.
Beg your pardon?
Payments for ecosystem services.
For example, and what happens with the rights there?
Well, you get compensated for providing the service.
Yeah. So the moment we start capturing a value, we are also defining a right. If we have a PES scheme, we define that the person who is providing the service has a right to compensation, has a right to be rewarded to this. We could also pass a rule and say, you need to provide this is a legal obligation. Then the right would be with the society to have this or to maintain this. So the moment we establish a mechanism to capture value, implicitly or explicitly wanting to or not, we establish a property right. Was that a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So sorry, just to sum up what you just said. You're saying that property right flows from the value, or the value flows from the property right?
Now I'm saying when we establish a mechanism to capture the value, which might before that be there but we're not aware of it, or we haven't calculated it, or only some people are aware of it. But the moment we establish a mechanism to capture it, so we introduce mechanisms that will incorporate the value into decision making, be it via a PAS scheme, be it via an offset system or whatever, we at the same time establish property rights. And most people are not aware of that. So a lot of the debate on should someone be allowed or not allowed is because it establishes rights and it puts people into different positions afterwards. Okay? We'll come back to that in some of the examples. So, on the poverty. No one has talked to you about GDP of the poor, am I correct? Or has someone touched that? Some other lecture? Seems it was mentioned. Okay, so basically what Hari Priya and Pavan did was recalculate GDP, the ecosystem service contribution to GDP, and also looking at who benefits from this. So these first values refer to the value of ecosystem services within classical GDP for these three countries. Ignore the millions there for now. And it mainly covers agriculture, forestry, fisheries. So the directly resource-dependent contributions to GDP. Now what they did was look at how much of this goes to poor people. And those are the values up there. This is the population of people depending heavily on ecosystem service, poorer people depending heavily on ecosystem services. And then they calculated which part of agriculture, forestry, and fisheries goes to them. So this is mainly forest dwellers, smallholder farmers, artisanal fishermen, and also calculated the value of products that are usually not marketed, like non-timber forest products or fuel wood and the like that comes directly from ecosystem services, as well as some of the regulating services like flood protection, for example. And then for these amount of people that were identified as highly dependent, the percentage of ecosystem services to their GDP, so to their income and well-being, is much, much higher, reaching 75%, 47%, and 89%. So this is an aggregate way of measuring and demonstrating the importance of ecosystem services for poorer segments of society. Now we'll go into agriculture as an example of natural resource management and some general numbers. 2.6 billion people relying on agricultural production systems for their livelihoods, 525 million small farms worldwide, out of which 404 million less than 2 hectares. And in total, small farms cultivate 60% of arable land. Now, interesting is this increase. If we have a 10% increase in farm yields, we can expect 7% reduction in poverty in Africa and still more than 5% in Asia. So the dependence of poorer households on agriculture is quite high. And what we've also increasingly seen over the last decades, and it's been increasingly demonstrated, is that green farming practices have increased yields, especially on small farms, to a considerable degree. So after the Green Revolution took care of the easily arable lands and under good conditions, we see that there are plenty of usually ecosystem service enhancing practices that can also help increase smallholder yields. In summary, an increase in overall GDP coming from agricultural labor productivity is on average 2.5 times more effective in raising the incomes of the lowest income quintile in developing country than an equivalent increase in GDP coming from non-agricultural labor productivity. So if you want to do something about poverty, it's worthwhile to invest in increasing agricultural labor productivity. Now, what's the situation in agriculture? We have, very broadly speaking, 2 general pathways that are problematic for, and both are problematic for ecosystem services. We have intensive agriculture characterized by high levels of pollution, e.g. from fertilizers or pesticides, soil erosion and deterioration, especially soil carbon being reduced, and biodiversity suffers at all levels, ecosystems, species, and genetic, with ever more increasing specialized farm production. On the other hand, we have extensive agriculture, usually in the not so favorable conditions, which leads to an ongoing process of deforestation. Usually we have problems of soil mining, nutrient depletion, especially when on slopes, also problems of erosion. So both developments of agriculture are problematic to ecosystem services, but there's quite a bit we can do about this. The central challenge being increase in yields while not decreasing, or even better, while increasing the other ecosystem services involved. Okay. Now, one easy way of fostering this from a policy point of view is organic agriculture. Why? Because in the concept of organic agriculture, it includes ecosystem services, especially soil management and maintenance, in its very concept, and therefore is an ecosystem service conscious way of improving or of working in agriculture. And here's an example from the Green Economy Initiative and reports from Uganda that actually there has been considerable growth in organic agriculture over the past couple of years. Impressive increase in exports, and this has had co-benefits of lower carbon emission and possibly even carbon sequestration, thus a contribution to climate, and in general provides a business opportunity, as most of the producers, although I'd say not necessarily quite as high amounts of production, are in developing countries, whereas most of the demand is in OECD countries. Okay, Further policy options for enhancing ecosystem services in intensive agriculture. Well, most developed countries have quite a set of different agri-environmental schemes. You have them here in the US, we certainly have them in Europe, and they have been enhanced in the reform of our agricultural policy. At least in Europe, but I imagine it may be similar here. This comes with rules of cross-compliance. So if you receive subsidies for agro-environmental schemes on part of your farm, you need to comply with some basic rules of protecting the environment on the rest of your farm as well. Some countries, such as Germany, for example, also regulate this directly. So a certain level of technology is mandated by regulation. You can't just go about and use far too much fertilizer. If that's not state of technology, then you are against the law. Of course, this is difficult to enforce, but it sets certain cutoff lines. You can go about rewarding less damaging practices. This is what agri-environmental schemes basically do. You can also do this by reverse auctions. I'll come to an example in a minute. Regarding biodiversity, you can foster interruption of large fields, e.g. by creating corridors, by having hedges, by having connecting landscape elements that will allow the ecosystem to maintain part of its integrity and its habitat qualities. May also be decisive for maintaining pollination services and the like. You can improve the technology and knowledge of the people who are managing and are working in agriculture, like applying just the right amount of fertilizer, because ultimately it's also not in their interest that there is a lot of runoff. And there are options to maintain genetic diversity, for example, also in situ. So there's in chapter 5 of the D2 report, there is an example of the sea rice initiative in the Philippines, where they maintained local varieties and improved them with local farmers, rice varieties, making them less dependent on international seed companies, but also providing options for adapting varieties to local circumstances. Okay, so here comes the example. This is from Pennsylvania. To reduce phosphorus loads in Conestoga watershed. So basically what they did was apply so-called reverse auctions. So farmers could bid and say what they would be wanting to receive as compensation for applying best management practices for phosphorus management. Then they used a tool, the nutrient net tool provided by the World Research Institute, to determine the phosphorus reduction of the different management practices. Farmers placed bids of prices they are willing to accept for specific measures. These bids were ranked according to the costs of saved phosphorus until the budget available for these auctions was exhausted. And they found out that this allowed them to achieve the goal of reducing phosphorus by approximately half what they had been with conventional cost share subsidy schemes. This approach was also piloted in USDA wetlands management program to reduce the cost of acquiring wetland easements. So this is a policy instrument. If you don't want to go by subsidies that will set a level price for everyone, but want to make use of the fact that some farmers will be able to provide a certain management practice or apply it at much lower costs, this is one policy option to do this. And again, I'll use this slide, which has a slightly different message. Again, with this, we are establishing property rights. So by the fact that we say we pay farmers to use less phosphorus, they are granted the right to use and apply as much phosphorus as they feel like, and society is willing to compensate this and pay them in order to reduce what they do and thereby reduce the damage to the water and supply the ecosystem services of water quality regulation, for example. So basically this graph shows different levels of environmental policy, and depending on the types of instruments we're using, we are granting the right to one or the other party to either be obliged not to pollute or to be compensated for not polluting. An example for the more extensive type of settings, from, in this case from India, setting of low rainfall, increasing deforestation that led to increasing runoff, decline of water level, till a point was reached when only 12% of arable land could be farmed due to water scarcity, and high levels of outmigration were the result. They then started regenerating degraded forests and building contour bonds and contour trenches, using two different government schemes that were providing some incentives for villages to improve their situation, and also an employment guarantee scheme. And by this, were able to double in a short time period of only 7 years the wells that had water again, and the areas under irrigation, also grass and consequently milk production. And poverty was reduced by 73%, people returning in the lapse of, say, 20 years. What is interesting also about this case is that they have a very strict water management regime. So together with water management authorities on a yearly basis, the amount of available water is determined. Then water is set aside for domestic and livestock use. The rest, 70%, goes to irrigation, with obligations to what crops can or cannot be cropped depending on water availability, and the remaining is percolated to recharge groundwater. Another example from Colombia, where pasture degradation was resulting in income loss and further expansion of pasture area, also affecting forest area. The challenge was how to tackle this poor pasture practices, and with them the problems of soil erosion and water runoff and biodiversity loss. Now, by improving through silvopastoral management, planting improved grasses, but also fodder shrubs and trees, a GF-funded project was able to recover 3,500 hectares. And what they did was pay initially for biodiversity and carbon fixation. This allowed to cover the initial investment costs, and some of the results were that after the project moved out and the payment scheme stopped, nonetheless farmers still kept up the practices because the local benefits it was providing at that point of being established and were high enough to enable them to maintain it and the maintenance costs. Okay, now forestry, very briefly. You know this better than I do. Some of the challenges: it's a long-term investment. It pays off only well into the future. A lot of people, especially smallholder farmers, are often not able to incur these costs. In many countries, it's also cumbersome, might not be the right word, but complicated due to regulation. I just came back from a stay in Thailand where they've all but banned forestry from their forests, and if you want to fell trees on private lands, you need a permit for felling the tree, then you need another permit for moving it from A to B, and then you need one to sell the products, etc. It's become very complicated. This basically dates back to the time when they had abundant forest and the state wanted to participate in all the income this was generating, but now it's practically preventing any timber industry from happening, aside from rubber and pulp production in low rotation trees, because both of these are not considered forest but agriculture and don't fall under this regulation. In many places, it's also not competitive with alternative land uses. Nonetheless, it has enormous co-benefits in terms of biodiversity, in terms of habitat, in terms of water, in terms of carbon. So it offers a huge potential for PES schemes along all of these lines. And when establishing schemes, there's of course also the possibility to influence what and how is being planted, so to influence what type of forest we're looking at, replacing monocultural plantation type forests by more varied forests where benefits are much higher. One poverty relevant example from Tanzania, applying the 6 steps we introduced last time. In this woodland area, trees and woodland were to a large extent cleared. This was to eradicate the tsetse fly, create land and space for agriculture and cash cropping. But they were reaching a point where goods and services of trees and woodlands, considered vital especially to agro-pastoralists in the region, but also to other members of the rural society, were disappearing. Specifying which ecosystem services were relevant, well, a lot of provisioning services, from fuel over building material to medicine and fodder, especially for dry season, and water provisioning and erosion reduction, as well as cultural value. So they resorted mainly to traditional knowledge on woodland management, because there had been a tradition of enclosures, especially for fodder reserves, that they were able to revive, and that was recognized then as the basis for forest restoration and a good opportunity to involve people directly and produce exactly those services that were needed. Changes could then be assessed, sometimes in terms of time required to obtain certain services, but also in the form of improved water quality and fodder availability, especially in dry season. So this has been a long-term project, but by resorting to the traditional, building on traditional knowledge and costumes, it was an empowering approach that created local people's ownership and enhanced their capacity to manage their resources. So approximately 500,000 hectares have been restored so far across quite a few villages. Income has improved, almost doubled in many of these, and the process is now being spread to at least 2 further regions in Tanzania. Okay, so this didn't involve valuation beyond appraising with people what they found important and what they wanted to restore. The next example does involve an extensive valuation study. This is from Indonesia, an area where a national park and surrounding woodlands were heavily affected, especially by the Indonesian army that got involved in a lot of illegal logging. And the national park director commissioned this study in order to show and illustrate the benefits from conservation. And Peter van Beukering and his team did this study and valued the 11 different services for 3 different use scenarios. And you can see that for all but the non-timber forest products, the agriculture and the timber services, the conservation has higher benefits than the 2 others. And what they also looked into is the distribution of these benefits to 5 different groups, out of which 2 are presented here, one being the local community, so the people living in the area, and then the logging, but not only logging industry, large companies using these resources. And you can see that, of course, the best scenario for the industry is the deforestation scenario, whereas for local communities, it's the conservation scenario, where especially through erosion and landslide protection, fire protection, water availability, the benefits from conservation are higher. Yes?
Do you know enough about this particular case to elaborate on the difference between the conservation and the selective use?
The conservation is basically no use of the area in the national park and some use in the area surrounding, whereas the selected use allows particularly non-timber forest products to be used, and I think some conversion of land to agricultural uses.
So conservation didn't have any non-timber forest products, or?
No use of non-timber forest products, very, very little. Yeah, I don't know what exactly this includes, but it's hardly anywhere, as the selective use does allow quite a bit. And that's a typical issue in national parks. If they are set up, many managers think this means don't touch anything, whereas particularly non-timber forest products, if managed sustainably, which of course has its ifs and needs careful management, could well be used without destroying most of the other functions. And then if we look at these benefits over time, we can also clearly see that, of course, the deforestation provides benefits much quicker, and the conservation benefits kick in mainly over time. And an interesting anecdote that when I heard Peter telling this example himself was when they first presented these results to the regional government, they really had serious problems in conveying. And they were very impressed by these numbers, and yeah, the immediate conclusion was, well, if it's so valuable, let's use it right away. So they didn't at all understand the concept of the value being in the conservation. And this, of course, leads to the typical situation: who has the political lobby? Of course, much more the logging industry than the local community. And of course, much more the short-term benefit over the long-term benefit. So actually achieving a conservation situation is quite a challenge. And immediately after the study, it didn't happen. In fact, the European Union, that had been financing part of the national park, pulled out because policy was not willing to support. And only recently, with a new election of governor in this province, a more greener development oriented policy has been put in place, and there's some hope this might change in the future. So there's been a lot of discussion on co-management, collaborative management, especially also in forestry, but also in fisheries, to achieve poverty reduction and sustainability. Here are some of summarized results from the source book that I put up in the reading list. I don't know if any of you had a chance to look into it. It may seem very picturesque and very basic for a Yale MSc course. What I really like about it is that it summarizes a huge body of literature and a whole field of investigation that is quite recognized at the very latest through the Nobel Prize to Lynn Ostrom 2 years ago. And it summarizes in 2-3 pages each time certain natural resource management issues with particular attention to property rights and collective action, and gives you at the end the relevant literature of really the scholars that have been doing the groundbreaking work there. So while being written for practitioners, it's also a very useful reference to get an overview and to find the relevant literature on these topics. So co-management has improved the formal access to forests, where very often formerly this was state property. People were not allowed to go in there. Nevertheless, they were living there. They were using these resources, but under very difficult rights situation, co-management has, in most cases, improved the situation. However, the benefits are mainly the ones for subsistence and as a safety net, so providing resources in lean season, for example. Whereas in most cases, government has maintained control over the more valuable resources and has influenced which trees to plant, which of course opens the possibility to have a more ecosystem service oriented approach. But if it's centrally governed, may also lead to far from optimal conditions, and often we have a situation of over-regulation. So the access to more valuable commercial products, especially timber or game, remains restricted. Often different expectations. There are often different expectations from the state on the one hand and local people on the other hand. Very trivially, but not always taken into account, not all local people are actually interested in forest management. So several schemes have also failed due to this. And better sharing mechanisms are needed both between state and community, as well as within communities in many settings. The general conclusion is to build more on local practices and increase the right to self-determination, which of course may again be in certain trade-offs with biodiversity conservation or long-term forest benefits, especially if the knowledge used to establish management does not adequately combine local and scientific knowledge. Okay, with this, I'd like to come to the conservation and poverty debate. So here I'm just going to briefly try and summarize. This is an ongoing debate for at least 20-25 years, and it's seen many changes from integrated conservation and development, and parks with fences, parks without fences, etc. What I was trying to say with the not interested forest community is that there's not much point, but we see this happening again and again, that you have some kind of a successful recipe for something. So forest community management in northern Guatemala has been very successful. Then maybe someone close just tries to copy this without ever even checking, is there this traditional relationship of the people to the forest? Are they actually interested in forest management, or is their interest actually in getting their income from somewhere else or in moving out? So that's just it sounds trivial, but it really happens again and again that these very trivial things are not taken into account. Now, of course, I mean, this is a very difficult balance to strike, especially in this whole poverty setup. Almost all countries that have been involved in agricultural land reform or in subsidized housing or in forest plot allocation or whatever, especially to combat poverty, have set up rules where usually they give people access to the resource under certain conditions, and it's usually not full set of rights. Usually at least the right to transfer in the sense of selling, sometimes even in the sense of inheriting, but certainly in the sense of selling, is precluded, because they don't want people to sell out and others to benefit from government subsidized resources, and then poor people moving out to something else. Nonetheless, in most settings, it still happens, because poor people often do get into situations where they have to, or they don't have the capacity to manage the resource because they might not have access to credit or to the knowledge needed or whatever. So this is a difficult balance to strike. And it needs a lot of going into the detailed context and finding out, okay, what are the options of actually generating income from this, and also generating income over the short term, and do the people have the resources, the knowledge and everything available that they need. So handing it over to a logging concession, of course, you can say, and many countries have established some sort of offsetting or some sort of minimal requirements if a forest is logged and taken down. This needs to be compensated by replanting somewhere else or by protecting or enhancing or whatever. But usually you will be losing most of the services unless you start regulating, okay, you're allowed to selectively log certain species and you will have to maintain integrity of XYZ in order to keep providing the rest of the services. What else were you referring to?
So can I just ask a
Yeah.
So, so what that suggests to me, maybe interestingly, is that since if you're going with sort of the bundle of sticks version of property rights, you might need to be more fine-grained about it if you want emergent sort of ecosystem service properties at a higher, because those sort of emerge at a higher, sort of like a more macro level in the landscape, right? You want to be sort of more fine-grained about establishing, if you're going to let a logging company come in, as you say, you can log X species, not Y species, in Z area, not W area. I mean, is that sort of what one, obviously there's gathering that information and creating that legal regime, but
We'll look a little bit into that in the next lecture on the spatial planning, where they are beginning to try to do this, to map ecosystem services over larger areas in order to then be able to determine, okay, if we want to give a forest concession, we better do it in these areas and not those other crucial areas. But you're right, it implies a much higher input with regard to information and information management over time also, and much more careful enforcement and monitoring. But probably that's what it boils down to, because if you look at the whole set of services, they usually do have different spatial extension, different temporal dynamics, and different implication with regard to the benefits they are providing to different sorts of people. But what has been shown, that with this co-management, particularly in forestry, but also in fisheries, there have been good results in many places if these conditions work out reasonably well. Yeah, but you need a close look at the rights and the services in order to achieve these. Okay, so some widespread, very general discourses on the relationship between conservation and poverty, that poverty leads to the destruction of biodiversity precisely because people depend on these resources and have no other opportunity. They overuse and destroy them. On the other hand, there's the contradicting discourse that traditional societies, and these often imply poorer people, actually ensure the conservation of biodiversity because they have been managing the resource over time in a sustainable way. They have a lot of local knowledge and are well able of doing so, much better than people coming in from the outside. There's also the storyline that biodiversity conservation can lead out of poverty by preserving the resources that poor people depend on. Others say they are interlinked and determine each other, so depending on just how poor people are or how much is still there, they are able to maintain it or it does degrade. Others say they may coincide in time and space, but actually have nothing to do with each other. And certainly you can find case studies to uphold any one of these, or almost also any combination of these. And the debate has been turning around this quite a bit. Now, what I'd like to present here is a summary from a symposium held last year in April by the Zoological Society of London that commissioned quite a few review studies to look into the literature and see if we do have any conclusive results. And this is some of the summaries on this, and then I'll come to the importance of ecosystem services in this whole context. Now, from a very broad perspective, there is considerable overlap in geographical terms between poverty and biodiversity hotspots or areas of special interest. Nonetheless, the specific overlap of valuable ecosystem services and of poverty on the subnational level is much less clear. So if you look at it broadly and on a world map, yes, but if you go into detail, it requires much more research and understanding. Poor households do depend disproportionately on biodiversity or ecosystem services, both for income and for insurance against risk. They very often directly depend there. It's only for the higher valuable resources that we find that richer households usually have a higher proportion. In general terms, I might have to say at the outset that the empirical basis for all these findings is quite sketchy. So they've looked into literally hundreds of studies, but very few have conclusive evidence that can actually be extrapolated. But these are the trends that can be generated there. So biodiversity can help lead out of poverty, but it is more important as a safety net. Sometimes it's also a poverty trap because the resources people depend on require so much input and work and actually don't offer good remuneration, so they stay right there. Conservation interventions, on the other hand, are often not well designed to actually help reduce poverty. They often actually crowd out poorer households, for example, by requiring formal property rights that these may not have. And the literature sees quite a potential in community natural resource management. I don't know if you caught on that first slide that currently about 30% of Africa's total land area is under common property. So we tend to think this is an exception, and it is in many countries, but in others it is one of the most important tenure forms, and if you don't design programs to take this into account, you miss out on quite a potential. They also found that the focus on cash benefit obscures the potential of other benefits, so that many studies that look into the settings more deeply find that biodiversity or wild resources, wild food are important. Risk mitigation are important safety nets. The fact that someone is involved in a co-management regime, which will actually be at least a first step in securing or in recognizing his rights there, that might be much more important to people than the actual cash income it generates. There also seems to be evidence that at least in the short run, biomass may matter more to poverty than biodiversity, so the sheer amount of what is being produced. And on a more conceptual level, it's the unclear definition of both biodiversity and poverty that actually hinders to establish a clear understanding of the relationships. And this is what I'd like to go into with my next two slides. So breaking down the poverty beyond the income debate. And this has also been ongoing forever, in spite of the fact that still most countries measure their poverty with a poverty line of saying less than $1 or less than something dollars per purchasing parity per day. There is widespread agreement that poverty comes as a multidimensional phenomenon. It's not simply about low incomes. It is multidimensional deprivation involving hunger, undernutrition, dirty drinking water, illiteracy, having no access to health service, all the way to social isolation and exploitation. And you can clearly see that at least the first 5 of these have a clear relationship to ecosystem services, especially for people who are living in rural settings, but in developing country also in many cities, some of these relations are maintained. Now, beyond these dimensions, Poverty can also be characterized by different aspects that start out with the incidence of poverty, taking into account how this develops over space and time, or how this is distributed, the intensity of poverty. So are we talking about people just barely under some minimum level of being able to provide for themselves, or are they far off such a position, especially if we talk about situations of exploitation or isolation, or the not possibility to have one's rights recognized. The inequality both between the poorer parts of population, as well as between better off groups in society and the poorer ones. And finally, also quite decisive for understanding the mechanisms of poverty, the volatility, meaning with what ease can people move in and out of poverty. The same for biodiversity. I'm not going to go into the details, but you all know the 3 different levels of diversity that we're interested in, and depending on whether we look at the composition, the structure, or the function of each of these, we come up with quite different types of indicators. So we usually find that studies look at any one of these aspects and any one aspect of poverty, and that makes it very, very hard to actually understand causal relationships or to get into some kind of detailed understanding of what's actually going on. So I continue with the findings. Of course, the relationship between biodiversity and poverty is not the same as the relationship between biodiversity conservation and poverty. And as pointed out earlier, the design of conservation measures is decisive here. So our very limited understanding of the dependence often also precludes us from finding solutions that are actually adequate to take into account how people depend or use natural resources or biodiversity. A very simple example from a national park in India, where they found that in an urban area, people were using this area very much for walking and for accessing a more peaceful and natural setting, and finally agreed to let local people into the park in the early morning hours without charging any income. And this was particularly for poorer people a good opportunity to actually keep using this, while at the same time the park could generate income by charging fees to better off people later on in the day. And many conservation designs part from the assumption that it is in the interest of people to conserve biodiversity or to conserve a certain species or the habitat for a certain species, where they could easily, with a stronger focus on the benefits that this area is providing to local people, get much more collaboration, much more understanding, and a much better targeted conservation design. We'll come a little bit into that in the next lecture as well, when we look at some of the cases there. It looks as though the international and the local levels are much better studied and understood than the intermediate ones. So there were plenty of world maps presented with ecosystem services and coincidence of hotspots and this and importance, etc., and a lot of local case studies, of course, but the more intermediate level situations of what in this particular legal and cultural setting is actually important, is actually doable, is actually causing an issue, is much less widespread. And the final conclusion, that the potential of a better understanding of the underlying causes of both, often of both poverty and biodiversity conservation, thus the potential of a much greener economy, less consumption-oriented growth, would allow or might take us much further than trying to understand the intricacies between these two aspects. Okay, so now our claim against this background is that ecosystem services might actually be a much more useful proxy to looking into this relationship rather than trying to understand the intricacies of the biodiversity 9 field matrix that I showed earlier. So some examples where, this is one example from Sri Lanka, where water tank management for paddy rice, so this was a traditional system of basically dug out ponds where water was stored in the wet season to then serve both for irrigation but also drinking water. And these were increasingly silting up, and there were more productive technologies available for paddy irrigation, and an ongoing debate, shouldn't the water better be used for hydropower or other uses upstream? And then the first thing they did was try and analyze the local situation and commissioned an evaluation study. This is Lucy Emerton and her team. And they decided to look only at the provisioning services. And interestingly enough, they found that if we look at what paddy cultivation, at the total value per unit of water tank area, that the paddy cultivation is some 6% of it only. That most of the value is actually with the domestic use, with livestock, with fisheries. And if we look even at the most simplest distribution indicator, so the percentage of households that actually benefits from it, we can also see that it's a small minority concerned with the paddy and making use of that, and a much larger proportion for the domestic water or the fisheries for that matter. So this focusing only or looking at the issue from the perspective of paddy irrigation would have lost out on 95% of the value and of the local use, and of 93 and high percentage of the people that are benefiting from it. So sometimes even this very first step of identifying who benefits and to what extent already takes us quite a ways in understanding the setting. I think there was. They used market values wherever they had them, and operated with proxies. I think especially for the domestic water, they calculated the value of the time required to get it out of other sources, if I remember correctly. But most of these products have market values in the setting. I'm not quite sure whether, the lotus flowers might be a very religious use only. Then it was a participatory exercise where they involved the villagers, so they might have just discussed a value with them on those. I'm not sure on all the details. Okay. So basically, what we're suggesting in this chapter, that was also on the classes system, is that it makes ecosystem services are a good indicator and a good proxy and a good way of understanding dependence and relationship, and suggest a way of assessing these in a poverty-sensitive way. So, of course, this adds on to the burden of all the things to take into account while doing an assessment. But if you use it as a checklist in the back of your mind just to see, okay, what might be important, I think it's already a useful tool. So what ecosystem services are in the area, and typically wild food, raw materials, non-timber forest products get overlooked. what regulating services are decisive for rural population, and look out for seasonal changes. Seasonal and also between years. Yes?
I was just curious if in doing an inventory, have there been any concerns about bioprospecting? Or how they've been sensitive to that in their studies?
Yeah. Trying to think if we have an example. Bioprospecting is definitely an issue in several countries, let's put it that way. Meaning quite a few of these countries, like the Philippines, local, or not local, but national people are well able to do these inventories themselves, so it's not naturally not always someone coming in from the outside doing it. I'm not aware of this having been an issue in such a study, beginning with the fact that there aren't that many studies, at least. I mean, we did a very active search for the TEEP cases and didn't come up with a terribly impressive number. I know it is always, it has often been an issue when people want to take specimens out of the country, then the bioprospecting alarm bells ring quickly, and I think rightly so. But I'm not aware of an ecosystem service assessment causing this. And particularly if you look at the village level and look coarsely over what are people using this for and why is this important to them. So then the question we also discussed or looked into briefly last time, which ecosystem aspects or which parts of an ecosystem are or may be critical for system stability, as far as you can judge that without profound ecological knowledge. I'm aware that that is not always easy. Then the question, which groups benefit to what extent from different ecosystem services? And yes, even if you only look at what percentage of households actually benefit from something, it is a rough indicator. Or if you look at the spatial coincidence of poor people and the availability of certain ecosystem services, if you are not able to go into more detail. But of course, as we saw with the poverty, there are many aspects in describing this dependency, which is then the next point. An important point here is this accessibility of substitutes, especially to poorer households. So who depends on these resources without being able to substitute them. Then of course the question of who holds what rights and how are these rights being recognized. So are people in a position to actually enforce these rights? What conflicts over rights or over actual availability and use are manifest or imminent? And finally, under which regime can the services best be provided in a specific setting, and what options are there to adapt this regime in order to be more poverty sensitive or more effective in terms of maintaining ecosystem services? Okay, and that's what I prepared for today, in order to have some time for discussion left. I have some more slides, but I'll only come to those if they touch subjects of your concern.